Chapter 81 War Plan. You are listening at Novel Full. Audio. Apophis and Antanria finally left the Secret Service building. They were both exhausted from lack of sleep, and probably from the various drugs they'd been knocked out with. This time, Apophis signaled to the first cab he saw, rather than order a limousine. It was a rotten cab, but it only cost 10 GC and sped quickly towards what was, without question, the best hotel on the planet. After 10 minutes of driving, Antanria fell asleep on Apophis's shoulder. His own eyes were heavy, too. To avoid falling asleep like Antanria had, Apophis asked the driver to turn on the radio. Soon, the galactic news filled the cab. "Hello, everyone. I am Kent Brockman, live from the Federal Senate. Today, the Assembly voted to declare a state of emergency throughout the Federation and to appoint Grand Admiral Azeroth as commander of the Federated forces at the border. Despite attempts to calm the situation through the mediation of the Galactic Council, tensions continue to escalate between the Federation and the Orc Empire. The Orcs have concentrated over 10,000 ships near the Chronos system, including 150 heavy cruisers, 80 dreadnoughts, and 10 capital ships. In response, the Federation has sent reinforcements to the zone. The Federation fleet has grown to 3,700 ships in that system, including 50 cruisers, 6 dreadnoughts, and 2 capital ships. Due to the obvious imbalance of forces, the Federation has called upon its two closest allies, the Lizardman Commonwealth and the Holy Elven Empire, to lend local aid. At the moment, both fleets are conducting maneuvers on the border. Despite continuously rising tensions, Chancellor Soli asks that all Federation citizens remain calm and have faith in our military's ability to deter the aggressors without bloodshed. Several light-years away, Grand Admiral Azeroth was holding a war council on the most secure space station in the Chronos solar system, the system bordering the Orc Empire and the Federation. The atmosphere in the room was highly tense. There were more than 50 admirals, but only 2 Grand Admirals. Unfortunately, these two men hated each other. On one side was Grand Admiral Azeroth, representing the human supremacists, and on the other side, Grand Admiral Wesley, a human-orc half-breed who supported the Federation's public ideal of a cosmopolitan society. The two Grand Admirals were both ambitious men, and very talented commanders. That was to be expected, considering their rank. Nevertheless, their ideological opposition made their cooperation nearly impossible, especially now that Azeroth had been made commander-in-chief. The meeting began with Wesley speaking. As of the last transmission, our allies have honored their pledges of help. The Allied Expeditionary Force has just integrated our great fleet, bringing our fleet to a count of 6,900 ships. I therefore propose to the War Council that we adopt a defensive strategy around the Chronos Command Station, taking advantage of its battery of over 50,000 automatic turrets. With such a defensive advantage, we can afford to wait for our opponent to move next. The majority of the admirals seemed to approve of this defensive strategy. It seemed like a reliable way to deter the enemy from attacking and, hopefully, avoid an all-out war. But Azeroth stood and replied, "I agree that a defensive strategy is safer. However, I must remind this council that, despite the addition of allied forces, we are still vastly outnumbered. No, we cannot rely on passive defense alone. Rather, I propose a surprise attack on the Orc fleet." Everyone in the room fell silent, and the atmosphere became as dismal as a funeral. No one dared to contradict their commander-in-chief, whether from fear or respect. Eventually, though, Grand Admiral Wesley spoke up. To attack directly would be to declare open war. Azeroth, annoyed at being contradicted, answered aggressively. "Perhaps there are some in this room who have forgotten that I was there at Era. I have seen the savagery of the Orcs with my own eyes. From the moment I saw the Orcs slaughter the pacifistic Tiadings, who were under Federation protection, I considered us to truly be at war with the Orcs. Therefore, let us ignore politics and focus on the military details. Our technology and firepower are superior to the enemy, so we must take advantage of them as soon as possible. I remind you all that the enemy's 10,000 ships make up only a sliver of the entire Imperial army of the orcs. The moment they call more reinforcements, which they can easily do, we have already lost. Admiral Wesley, I caution you not to let your very natural and commendable sympathy for your countrymen cloud your judgment. Under other circumstances, I know your military genius would have already seen the wisdom of my plan. Azeroth knew he could not convince Wesley, but that was not his goal. He merely wanted to justify this military operation and avoid immediate disobedience from his subordinates. The Federation military code did not give even the commander-in-chief absolute power over those below him. If his subordinates considered him to act against the interests of the Federation, a majority vote could easily oust Azeroth and result in Wesley taking his place, as he would be the next highest ranking officer. Judging by the silence after Azeroth's first announcement, that danger was closer than he liked it to be. Despite Azeroth's provocative words accusing him of being sympathetic to the orcs because of his heritage, Wesley didn't take the bait. I think it would prove to be a historically catastrophic mistake to attack first. As to my experience and allegiances, I've served in the Federation military for 60 years. The last 10 of which have been in the role of Grand Admiral. I don't need any military or political lessons from a novice like you, Azeroth, who tries to puff us up with words about how we're not politicians when you strut around with them yourself on Terra. Azeroth gave him a broad smile and continued. Thank you for sharing your perceptions, Grand Admiral. Now, as I am Commander-in-Chief, let us begin developing the battle plan. Since you are so experienced, Wesley, it stands to reason that you should spearhead the assault in your capital ship. Chapter 82 Renier. You are listening at novelfull.audio. After their cab ride ended, Apophis and Antanria finally arrived at the Royal Palace of Terra, the finest hotel on the planet. Compared to the planet-wide city itself, the hotel was relatively small. Compared to the real world, however, it occupied as much space as a small city. The unimaginable luxury destination employed more than 100,000 people and robots, mixing new and old styles to accommodate every taste and desire. The hotel dated back to the time of the Zetark Empire, making it one of the oldest hotel complexes in the galaxy, and it made every effort to cultivate an atmosphere matching its reputation. Antanria and Apophis arrived at the receptionist's office in a pitiful state. They smelled of body odor and filth because of their imprisonment, and over 50 robot butlers who served as a first line of security looked down their noses at the two. The receptionist glanced at the security guards, as if asking them to escort these bums outside. When Apophis approached, the receptionist said with contempt, "I'm sorry, sir. We don't have any more rooms." As far as he was concerned, the mere presence of these two stained the presence of the hotel. Apophis didn't protest. The receptionist was completely beneath him, and he just wanted to get his room and be done with all of the people around him. He set 100,000 GC on the desk and said calmly, "Good afternoon. I need your best suite for 3 nights." The receptionist, who only made 3,300 GC in a month, an excellent salary, wanted to die of shame and terror. Most big customers made online reservations to avoid having to talk to lowly staff. For such obviously important guests to show up and demand the best while looking like bums was unheard of. "My apologies," said the receptionist, trying to recover quickly. "It must be that you are the gentleman for whom we had set that suite aside. Do you require anything else, sir?" Apophis didn't say another word but only glared at the receptionist while he nervously entered information into the computer. The room was beautiful and spacious, over 1,000 square meters in area. And of course, it gave access to the hotel's many luxury services. Jacuzzis, saunas, massages, artisan chefs, escorts, and more than 100 other luxuries. Despite this wealth of options, Apophis and Antanria went directly to bed. Apophis warned Antanria that he'd be asleep for 2 to 3 days, gave her 10,000 GC in cash, and then went to bed. Then, once he was settled, Apophis disconnected from the game. ORC defense base. Not long after the Federation planned their attack under Grand Admiral Azeroth's lead, another war council took place, that of Great Warlord Renier. Renier, unlike Azeroth, was a rank A ascensionist in addition to a great military commander. Among the Orc Empire's military, only competence mattered, that meant strength and intelligence enough to outperform one's peers and enemies. The Orcs were proud of their meritocracy, their tradition of following a leader who proved himself in battle, rather than because they were appointed through politics. Renier was cunning and powerful, but his greatest distinguishing feature was the aura of mystery that surrounded him. He was actually not an orc, but a humanoid xeno with an appearance very close to that of a human. His skin was black-gray, and a mask covered his face. Many orcs believed Renier was the spawn of the dark gods or of demons, but no one knew the truth. All anyone knew for certain was that he had served the Orc Empire throughout the reigns of different Orc emperors for a whole century. Renier was one of the greatest warlords in the history of the Orc Empire and had fought in over 1,000 space wars, conquering hundreds of solar systems for the Orc Empire. In contrast to the Federation War Council, silence reigned in the Orcish war room. Renier calmly explained his plan to the 100 Orc commanders, and they respectfully listened. According to our newest intelligence, the humans are preparing to attack our fleet within the week, a surprise attack, they believe. Their combined fleet, drawing upon Lizardman and Elvish reserves, remains numerically still inferior to our own forces. Their firepower is likely superior to our own fleets, early war games suggest this, and the alpha strike they are planning would allow for the greatest use of this advantage. Our strategy, then, is to concentrate our firepower on the Elvish and Lizardman forces. These nations pledged their troops under the belief their presence would deter us, and they are not prepared to sacrifice their lives for the sake of the humans. They will turn and flee when they realize the danger. However, the humans must open fire first. They must be the ones to start this war. This is a direct order from the Emperor. Glory to the Empire. Glory to the Emperor. Glory to Khorne. Every officer present repeated this last line over and over. Glory to Khorne. Glory to Khorne. 2 Orc soldiers stepped out from the shadows, bringing a gagged human prisoner to his knees before Renier. With one clean movement, Renier plunged his fingers into the man's chest and ripped out his still-beating heart. The human collapsed without even having time to understand what killed him. Renier whispered the profane words of an ancient ritual, and the heart ignited with dark red fire as a terrible voice thundered from the fire and reverberated throughout the room. Khorne accepts this sacrifice of blood. You will be victorious, Renier. Your enemy's blood will flow, unceasing, and Khorne will drink it all. The orcs clasped fists to their chests and howled their warmaster's name, chanting in rapturous glee. Renier! 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 Chapter 83 Dung Eater. You are listening at novelfull.audio. When Alexander opened his eyes in the gaming booth, he found that it was 4 a.m. in the real world. He took his time as he rose and readjusted to the slightly different sensations of the real world. While he waited for the sun to rise, he connected to the forums for Horus. As he'd suspected, his inbox was stuffed with over 15,000 unread personal messages. Nearly all were meaningless, trolls, insults, proposals of all kinds, including many applications to join his guild, Eclipse. Of course, Alexander didn't even manage the guild anymore. That was all up to Lotus, now that she was the guild leader. Alexander took advantage of his free time to sell GC. The GC/credit ratio had improved greatly since the events of Era, and today he could gain 2.89 credits for each GC he sold. Not bad at all. Alexander sold 5 million GC and quickly received 14,450,000 credits in exchange. What a staggering number. It would even be enough to house his family in Paris's 16th district, the bourgeois neighborhood everyone aspired to. With this in mind, he looked over the options which the real estate agency had sent him based on his stated requirements the other day. Of course, the prices for every building were completely unreasonable, but then, that's what one had to pay for top-of-the-line services and amenities. The 16th district had the best policemen, firemen, hospitals, schools, and even special air treatment facilities to ease the effects of pollution. By the time Alexander was done surveying real estate options, it was only 6 a.m. He went back to the forum and posted a topic about his quest, massive conscription, encouraging players to join the Federation army and clarifying that all players would suffer persecution if the quota was not met. Of course, this simple measure wouldn't be enough to recruit the 10 million players he needed, but it would be a start. After all, he was quite notorious, and people would pay close attention to his posts simply because of who he was. After posting this topic, Alexander looked at the forum's hottest topics. Many were discussing the possibility of a war between the Federation and the Orc Empire, of course. After all, 99% of players were in Federation space at any given time, and were obviously worried about whether their gameplay would be affected by the war. The Armageddon era was still fresh in everyone's minds, and few players looked forward to another event that might completely stall their gaming efforts. Yet, many others were excited at the prospect of war. For them, Horus's ability to change so much from day to day was the most exciting part of the game. Nevertheless, Alexander knew the impending galactic war wasn't as serious as it looked. Wars of such scale were extremely expensive for nations in the third technological stage, because ships had such exorbitant costs of production. In his first life, most wars were brief affairs that were resolved after only 1 or 2 battles. After that point, all nations involved tended to be reluctant to spend any more resources, which might leave them helpless against enemies waiting to pounce. It was well known that most nations preferred losing a little territory rather than a fleet, so border skirmishes were often uneventful, so long as the winner didn't press their advantage too much. Most often, it was a fleet commander's ability to conserve their ships and to withdraw without suffering casualties that brought them honor, rather than their ability to wipe out the enemy in battle. Knowing all this, Alexander simply ignored most of the topics concerning the war. Instead, another topic caught his eye. A discussion of the top bounties in Horus. Top 10 bounty list. 1 Apophis, Eclipse. 115 million GC 2 Lucifer, Lord of War. 76 million GC 3 Caesar, Renovatio Imperii. 69 million GC 4 Zeus, Spartan. 47 million GC 5 Joker, Blackjack. 44 million GC 6 Mario, Toxic. 40 million GC 7 Arthas, The Scourge. 34 million GC 8. Zelda, Hyrule. 29 million GC 9 Dung Eater, /. 27 million GC 10 Scorpion, Lord of War. 10 million GC. Unsurprisingly, the first 8 slots were filled by the 7 gods, and Apophis, of course. However, Scorpion's place on the board was very interesting. In Alexander's former life, Scorpion had discovered the unique quest in the ruins which Apophis had hunted down upon first joining this new life's version of the game, but then had completely disappeared from relevancy. In this new life, though, Scorpion had become the 10th most infamous player in the game. It seemed that Apophis stealing from him had given him the drive he needed to crawl his way to the top. But the entry which intrigued Alexander the most was Dung Eater in 9th place. Not only did Alexander not recognize the player, but he was the only one on the entire list who didn't have a guild. He'd become the 9th most infamous player in the game, which almost surely meant he was the 9th best player in the game, with no help. Before he could spend any time researching this mysterious player, Alexander received a holo.watch message from Lauren, the friend who'd lent him the VR helmet. Lauren. Answer me. Stop playing dead and give me back my helmet. You'd better not have broken it. Alexander was overcome with embarrassment. Yes, he supposed the exam period would now be over, and his friend would be eager to jump into the MMORPG everyone was constantly talking about. He quickly sent back a message. Alexander. Sorry man, I was playing. I'll see you this afternoon at the Café Saint Michel in Sector 5. Alexander was about to research Dung Eater, but then the sound of his parents' alarm clock came faintly up from below. He rose and happily went downstairs to meet them. Chapter 84 Cancer. You are listening at novelfull.audio. When Alexander joined his father and mother downstairs, he found them having breakfast. They were overjoyed to see him, of course. Because of their different schedules, it had been almost a month since the last time they'd seen each other. His mother had simply left him food in the fridge, which Alexander ate during the infrequent times he was outside Horus. Despite living in the same apartment, they hardly saw each other. Alexander kissed his mother on the cheek, then his father, then sat down to enjoy the croissants and pan au chocolate which his father had brought from a nearby bakery. But the atmosphere during breakfast was strange. Alexander's parents kept exchanging odd looks, and once breakfast was finished, they all sat for a few awkward moments, which was unusual. Eventually, Alexander's mother looked at her husband, then at Alexander, and said, "Alexander, I have something to tell you." Alexander listened attentively. "Yesterday I was at the clinic," she said. "They detected a tumor in my left breast. According to the analysis, it's in stage 3 already. That's, a very aggressive and dangerous phase." She burst into tears, unable to continue. To hear the word cancer from his mother's lips was terrifying, even if Alexander had prepared for this event due to experiencing it in his first life. After all, that had been one of his great regrets in his first life, that he'd been unable to give his mother the money she needed for treatment. This time would be different. Alexander said, "Mom, Dad, I have something to tell you, too. I know that for the last few months, I've not really been present. Well, I'm happy to say that all the work paid off. I've solved all our economic problems, I think." Hardly able to contain his pride, Alexander showed them the sum in his bank account, the immense amount of 14,500,000 credits. Both his parents' jaws dropped in shock. Alexander added, "Mom, it's going to be okay. You'll have the best cancer treatment in the world. More than that, our crappy life is over. We'll be able to move in a few days to the best district in Paris. I'm sure that, in a few months, I'll be able to get as much as 50 million, and we can even go live on Mars." His father rose slowly and slapped his son across the face. "You think money buys everything? How dare you? Our life is far from shitty. Your mother and I worked hard, day in and day out, to give us a better life than most. We've always had food on our plates, even if we've had to tighten our belts from time to time, but when have the three of us been miserable? Alexander, we've always been happy together. This race for money and fame has made you forget what really matters, your family. We need you right now, not just your money." His mother, still shaking with tears, stood and embraced her son. "It's stage 3 cancer, Alexander. The doctor said even the best treatment in the world will probably be ineffective. It's all right. I don't care about that. All I want is to enjoy being with my son for the next few months, before I join the Creator." Chaos filled Alexander's mind. In his first life, his parents had cursed and lamented at their lack of money once his mother received his diagnosis. "If only we had the money," they'd said. "Then it would all be fine." This is the lot in life for people not lucky enough to be rich, I suppose. It was partially because of this idea that his mother could have been saved if they'd only had more money that Alexander had abandoned real life and spent so much of his time in Horus. But now, this was a hard blow. Alexander slowly realized that his parents' lamentations in his first life had been a method of coping with the tragedy. Somehow, it was far more hopeless, in their minds, to have a disease that nothing could cure than to think, "If only we had more money." And, of course, it wasn't just a matter of money, but of personal arrogance. He couldn't bear the thought of again becoming the same loser he'd been in his old life. Chapter 85 Forfeiture. You are listening at novelfull.audio. Alexander sat in a bar, finishing his sixth whiskey. There was no solution for his mother. Even in the 22nd century, scientists and doctors still hadn't found an effective treatment for terminal cancer. He'd been thinking over and over about the true purpose of his resurrection. Why had he been offered another chance, but not his mother? What was the point of being able to redo his wasted life if he couldn't even save her? Just as he was about to call for a seventh whiskey, a disgustingly corpulent man, twice Alexander's size, swaggered into the bar and ordered a beer in a fat, choked voice. Alexander, totally drunk, laughed at him and said, "You're a real head case, you son of a bitch." The enormous man ignored this provocation. He sat down and gulped his beer as if he hadn't heard anything. Outraged, Alexander staggered to his feet and hurled his glass at the man's face. His aim was drunkenly useless, and the glass sailed harmlessly into the well. The burly man snarled and rushed at Alexander. He wanted to punch this fat idiot in the face, but the whiskey had dulled his reflexes, and his punch was slow and awkward. The man easily avoided the blow and retorted with a headbutt into Alexander's eye socket. He collapsed immediately, failed to get back up, and fell into darkness. During the murky time that followed, Alexander remembered all the stages of his mother's cancer at the end of her first life. The hair loss, the physical weakening, the eventual coma. And then her slight remission. The renewal of hope. It hadn't lasted, and his mother had died within 70.2 hours of the first sign that things were wrong again. After her death, Alexander's relationship with his father had deteriorated, especially when Alexander missed his mother's funeral. Considering his father to be responsible for failing to make enough money to afford her treatment, Alexander had cut all ties with his father and drifted into the life that eventually killed him. Hours passed as Alexander continued to relive the most painful memories of his old life. Would he be forced to watch his pitiful failure until the end? Surely it would be better just to die for real and leave all this misery behind. Eventually, Alexander woke in an alley in the early evening. Vomit soaked his clothes, and his throbbing eye was swollen shut. Alexander used the camera in his hollowed out watch to examine his own face and found that his eye was blackened, with a dried up cut on the eyebrow. Alexander got up from the ground, head pounding, and started walking in the streets of Sector 18. After a few minutes of walking, he arrived in a vile district full of people sleeping on the ground or otherwise consumed by a drug trip. These were the slums of Paris, where the poorest people and the drug addicts of the city took refuge, a district totally abandoned by the authorities. Someone familiar caught Alexander's eyes. It was Amir, his dealer in his former life. After his whole life had fallen apart in his first life, when even Emma left him, Alexander took refuge in the readily available drug called crack. It was the perfect drug, an aerosol inhaler which, for a few hours, made one forget all their problems. Its cloud of indescribable happiness was readily available at the cost of only 9 credits per dose, and was extremely addictive. Everyone knew that one puff was enough to make you an addict for life. No detox or medication could cure the addiction. Only death. Alexander bought an inhaler from Amir, then isolated himself in a filthy, stinking corner. In his first life, Alexander had no idea what he was getting into when he took his first dose. This time, he did. Alexander raised the inhaler to his lips and prepared to draw the crack into his airway, where it would sink into the mucous membranes of his mouth, throat, and lungs and be part of him until the day he died. Chapter 86 Despair. You are listening at novelfull.audio. But just as he was about to commit an action from which there was no return, a flash of white light burst in front of his vision. Alexander flinched as his vision went black. But he was blind, not unconscious. Alexander dropped the inhaler, gasping and flailing around. His hand scraped against the nearby wall, disrupting the instinctive, illusory sensation of falling into a bottomless pit. But just as he was getting his bearings, a humanoid of pure light appeared in the darkness. It looked him straight in the eyes and reached out a hand. Alexander couldn't even move. He was completely paralyzed by the magnificence of this being. But after a few seconds, the figure disappeared without a word. Alexander's vision returned, as though nothing at all had happened. His first thought was that the figure was a hallucination, but he quickly decided that it must have been real after all. Alexander wasn't particularly religious, though he believed in God. Despite this lack of religiosity, he believed what had just appeared was a sign, a divine sign. A message not to give himself over to despair in this new life where he'd been given a second chance. Everything was starting to grow clearer. It was all connected: his resurrection, his renewed relationship with Emma, his recent successes in both Horus and in his real life. And now this apparition had appeared. To Alexander, it was clear that a mighty destiny lay before him, demanding to be pursued. Horus and the real world were connected, according to Cortana. Though Alexander had been skeptical of these before, the vision he'd just received supported that. Due to the incredible detail of Horus, especially regarding the humanity of NPCs, many conspiracy theories had arisen about this concept in Alexander's first life. Some believed Cortana had copied the real universe. She had, they believed, run an incredible simulation based on all the astronomical data gathered by real world astrophysicists. Therefore, they said, Horus was effectively a mirror universe of the real world, since it was based on real-world data. Nevertheless, this didn't match Alexander's experiences in the game. There were too many discrepancies between famous galactic structures in the real world, for example. And now, it turned out that the god, emperor who called himself Apophis had existed long before Apophis himself had joined the game. Perhaps this was a key part of the relationship between the two dimensions. Technology in Horus was so advanced that NPC hospitals could cure even late-stage cancer. If all the science of Horus corresponded to science in the real world, then perhaps there was a solution to reverse his mother's fate. However, there was still a huge problem. In Horus, all pure technological information was censored from the eyes of players. Even when characters such as engineers gained technological knowledge, they received it in a casual and gamified way. They didn't gain all the true knowledge of creating gadgets and machines, but only received game skills which let them create these items. A skill like technological learning, Federation, was like a key to unlocking crafting and repairing actions, rather than a textbook explaining how Federation technology worked. So there was an impenetrable border between the two dimensions. If there was a way to access the information Alexander needed directly, it would be incredibly complex. Regardless, an unfortunate truth became obvious. For Alexander to find some sort of bridge between the dimensions, he'd need to keep playing Horus, while his mother's health ran out. If he failed, he would have lost the last moments they could have been together. However, Alexander remembered a detail he'd previously forgotten. In his first life, his mother's 6 months of life after her diagnosis had been thanks to the low-cost treatment which was all his father was able to afford. Even that had eaten up all their savings and sent him into deep debt, and had, of course, only given her 6 months to live. But with so much more money at their disposal, even if the money couldn't cure Alexander's mother, it seemed very likely that she'd get more than 6 months of life this time around. Would this bonus time be enough to earn Alexander success in his mission? It was an insane gamble based on a wild theory that might not even be right, this concept that all the technology of Horus was equivalent to that in the real world. But this gamble was all Alexander had. It was hope. It was something he could do rather than wait idly for his mother to succumb to the agony of her illness. Alexander's inhaler lay close to the ground where he'd dropped it. He picked it up and stared at it for a long time. Then he hurled it to the pavement, crushed the plastic under his shoe, and began his determined march back home. Chapter 87. Good friend, you are listening at novelfull.audio. Alexander met Laurent at a Sector 12 bar. He'd needed to postpone their original meeting time, but only mentioned that a personal problem had come up. Laurent was one of Alexander's oldest friends. They'd known each other since elementary school and had always shared a passion for video games, especially MMOs. Laurent's parents had always limited him to playing 1 hour during weekdays and 2 hours per day on weekends, which had always limited his progress. But things were about to change. After the two friends shook hands, ordered beers, and sat at the table, which was infinitely better than the counter at which Alexander had gotten drunk, as this was one of the best bars in Paris, Alexander spoke up. "I'm really sorry I didn't answer you earlier, but Horace just took up all of my time. But here, I've got your helmet." Alexander held out the VRI helmet Laurent had lent him all those months ago, which had allowed him to restart his life in this new world. The advantage of the VRI helmet over the old, standard VR helmets was that it scanned its user's face and brain, thereby tying user accounts to the actual person wearing them. This solved many problems which had plagued MMOs in the past, such as botting and hacking. If you were banned from a game using a VRI helmet, then you couldn't fool the brain scanner into letting you make a new account. Best of all, of course, it allowed for instant and secure connectivity to game servers. VRI helmets truly allowed for a renaissance of MMORPGs. Laurent examined his helmet, making sure it wasn't damaged. Though scalping prices had dropped since Horace's launch, VRI helmets were still very expensive, nearly 20,000 credits new. For a middle-class student like Laurent, this was an enormous sum. The helmet was intact, despite the intensive use of Alexander and his father. Their family was very accustomed to taking good care of their belongings, since they had little to spend on repairing careless mistakes. Laurent finally said, "Thank you. Honestly, I was starting to think I'd never see it again. As for me, I just finished my computer science studies. Now I'm looking for a job, which gives me plenty of time in the near future to start Horace. Sure feels good to not be the only person I know who isn't playing it." Pro streamer was saying it broke 400 million players at once. Isn't that insane? You're so lucky to have started right away. How far are you? Did you manage to join a good guild and make some money? Alexander knew Laurent was a skilled player, as well as a nice and faithful human being, so he intended to invite his friend to join Eclipse. With that in mind, there was no point in hiding his identity. "Yes, I guess you could say I've had a good start. I'm LVL 26 in the Eclipse Guild. My in-game name is Apophis. Don't know if you've heard of me, Dilvico." Those last words were spoken with a tinge of ironic arrogance, of course. Laurent knew exactly who Apophis was, as Alexander had known he would. Of course, Alexander had never been a pro gamer in any other MMO, so this claim was ridiculous, and Laurent took it as a joke. "Well," he said with a grin, "I'm hiding my secret identity too. My real name is William Woke, aka Lucifer. You know, the best player in the world. I have 1 billion credits, 30.8 houses, and 18 flying cars, and I sleep with Josephine Portman every night." The two men burst out laughing and Laurent added, "Seriously, what's your in-game name?" Alexander knew he couldn't convince him with words. He'd lied to Laurent many times in the past, and this was quite the incredible story, regardless of his reputation. So Alexander put his holo.watch into projection mode. A 3D web page appeared, displaying his bank account with its unmistakable balance of 14,500,000 credits. Chapter 88. Laurent, you are listening at novelfull.audio. Laurent was shocked. After a few moments of stunned silence, he said, "It's true. It's really true. You're Apophis." Everyone in the restaurant heard the shouting and stared at the two men. Alexander, embarrassed, let out a huge belch to try to discredit what Laurent had just said. "As if I didn't have enough enemies," he muttered in a low voice, "you have to shout like that in such a public place." "Sorry," said Laurent. "I'm just in shock. How'd you manage to accomplish that with just a simple VRI helmet? We both know you're no genius when it comes to MMOs, and it's not like there was much information released beforehand you could study." With all the big guilds investing so much money to build the best dungeon teams possible, how the hell do they keep failing while you go on to win Nightmare and Ironman dungeons on your first try? Not to mention, you manage to get to be the most powerful despite the super guilds taking so much experience from their regular players and giving it all to their superstars. Alexander didn't want to reveal any information about his resurrection until he knew the truth behind it, of course. It was possible that if the truth spread, he might find himself in real danger from organizations who wanted to harness this power for themselves, even though Alexander had no idea how it worked himself. Instead, he said, I just followed my instincts and stopped trying to overthink everything. Horus is a game that rewards that, as it happens. Laurent was skeptical. He knew that Alexander was hiding something important, but didn't want to press the issue. Instead, Laurent changed the subject. You know, when I lent you the helmet, we made a deal. You said you'd help me get started once I could play, remember? Alexander answered, you can count on me, of course. As long as you join my guild. Laurent was disappointed. He'd lent Alexander this very expensive equipment which had allowed him to become the top player in the world, and now Alexander wasn't even really honoring his side of the deal. Nevertheless, Laurent accepted the condition. After all, it wasn't every day that a player at Alexander's level offered to help him. Their conversation shifted and the two friends started to talk about girls. By the time evening came around, they were both well beaten up by their many rounds of drinks. By the time Alexander returned home by cab, it was about 3 a.m. Though he had many things to do and little time in which to do them, Alexander also realized that proper rest was vital. It had been almost a month since he'd slept anywhere except in his gaming booth. Though the device fed him a steady drip of vitamins, it was still detrimental to a player's health in the long run. Alexander slept hard until 8 a.m., at which point, and after drinking many glasses of water to alleviate the dehydration of all his drinking, he felt refreshed. He would have liked to sleep for longer than 5 hours, but he decided to make do. Alexander then went downstairs and had breakfast with his parents. Of course, the revelation of the previous day was still fresh in everyone's minds, and silence reigned. But Alexander was determined not to allow himself to give in to despair again. After breakfast, he would need to meet the real estate agent who he was supposed to have met yesterday, though he'd neglected to do so due to all his drinking. Also, he wanted to hire a butler to handle certain tasks for him. The real estate agent showed Alexander several apartments in Sector 16. After careful consideration, he chose the most expensive of the bunch, which set him back 4 million credits. The apartment was about 350 square meters, not a mansion, by any means. The price of living space was at least twice as expensive as any other part of Paris. Of course, Alexander would actually have to convince his parents to move into it. But first, now that Alexander had a big apartment in a rich neighborhood, it was time to hire someone to take care of it, a butler. Chapter 89 Butler. You are listening at novelfull.audio. Alexander knew little about the world of butlers. After all, he'd never exactly been a rich man before. So he did what any reasonable man would in his situation, looked up butlers on the internet. There were a surprising number of butler agencies in Paris, but the best one was called Zutler. Apparently, this agency represented a huge number of butlers and boasted the perfect fit for any need. This was precisely what Alexander was looking for, a versatile majordomo who could fulfill every task Alexander might need done, and who would also be utterly discreet and cunning. Alexander needed to keep his anonymity. He remembered what Enzo Romano had said in his first life about this very subject. That was, of course, the real name of the player who went by Caesar online. According to him, revealing his true identity to the world was the greatest mistake he ever made. Alexander traveled to the Zutler offices in Sector 8 on the Champs-Élysées. He researched it more on his cab ride and found that Zutler was actually one of the most luxurious companies in Paris. Their customers were the richest 0.0001% in the world, people willing to pay exorbitant prices for perfect service. Some people in society were aghast at the rates Zutler demanded from its clientele, but despite this, the agency never lacked for customers. In the 22nd century, as it was said, money reigned supreme. Those without money had no right to live and were expected to turn to begging or prostitution if they wanted to avoid starving. The Zutler building was absolutely beautiful. Its outer appearance was that of an ancient, 50-meter stone building like a temple, and an ornate statue of a golden tiger crouched in front. The interior was luxurious, and filled with about 100 people standing around, dressed crisply in the regalia of butlers. This was one of the unique traits of Zutler. Rather than relying on a formal application process to match a client to a butler, prospective customers instead made a visit in person and made a mutual agreement with an individual butler themselves. And if a butler failed to land a contract within 30 days of leaving their last position, they were let go with neither notice nor ceremony. This tactic was certainly cruel, but Zutler claimed it created the ideal relationship between master and servant. To date, very few clients had been disappointed with their butlers, so the strategy seemed productive. Alexander had many of these details in mind as he stepped through the office's front door. Everything would be decided between him and his future butler, the tasks to regularly be performed, the salary, the duration of the contract, and 100 other details. Zutler took 10% of all their butlers' pay as an agenting fee, but even the lowest paid butler among them received what most people would call a very fair compensation. After all, only the very rich could afford a full-time butler in the first place. Alexander was shy, being quite conscious that he wasn't at all a part of this social milieu. An aura radiated from him that said he was not like the usual clientele, and all the butlers could sense it. Nevertheless, Alexander summoned his courage and approached the first butler he found. The man completely ignored him. He could see that Alexander was newly rich, completely unaccustomed to this lifestyle. Such a young rich fellow would probably be resentful of paying him well, not to mention constantly demanding the impossible. Alexander was shocked by the man's coldness, but he tried to brush it off and approach a few others. Over and over, he received the same aloof treatment. Some were more professional and offered polite refusals, but many simply ignored Alexander as though he didn't exist. Alexander wished he'd visited a tailor first and purchased the outfit of a proper rich man, but in his heart, he knew that even that wouldn't give him the graces and social knowledge of a man of high social status. But just as Alexander was about to leave, disgusted, he noticed a 30-year-old female butler nearby, with blue-stained fingernails. This was a sure sign of crack addiction, a physiological effect that was quite common among addicts, though people in the general population wouldn't recognize the sign. After all, drug addicts were extremely persecuted in most cities, and Paris was no exception. Addicts had to stay away from most civilized areas if they didn't want to be arrested and charged. However, it was common for drug addicts to hold down a job and blend in with those around them, allowing them to afford their drugs and to lead relatively normal lives. This had been the case for Alexander in his former life, after all. But even then, he constantly was aware that, if his addiction were discovered, he'd lose his job and quickly sink into poverty. So Alexander had enormous leverage over this woman, no matter what she thought of him and his new money. "Hello," he said, moving close to her and lowering his voice. "I'm Alexander. As you might imagine, I'm looking for a butler to take care of various aspects of my daily life while I work. I need a devoted and faithful person, someone who can be discreet about her employer's professional and private lives." To Alexander's surprise, he didn't even need to open with the leverage. The woman gave him a polite nod and replied, "Hello, sir. My name is Diana. I am unmarried, unattached, and without children. I am 30.2 years old and have the necessary skills for domestic proficiency in cooking, sewing, fashion, and asset management. I can invest myself fully in a contract without duration." Alexander was interested at once. She was pretty and had a light, elegant accent. To have such a charming woman in his service would be a good way to make Emma jealous. I'm impressed by your skills, he said, but I have one very important question. He lowered his voice even further. How many times a day do you do drugs? Diana went pale. She'd been found out. This could be the end of everything for her. If word of her addiction got out, she'd not only lose her hard-won job at Zutler, but might never work a proper job again. She tried to remain calm. I don't know what you're talking about, sir. Alexander nodded, expecting the reaction. He was impressed with how quickly she'd recovered, in fact. Listen, the fact that you're a drug addict is no problem for me. Like I said, I'm impressed by your skills. I'm not trying to trap you, but I do need to know what kind of consumer you are. You understand, right? Diana hesitated, but quickly realized that she had no choice. Even though crack was relatively inexpensive per dose, her constant need meant that she spent many credits per week on it. No matter what strange situation she might be getting herself into, Diana needed money, and she needed it quickly. So she eventually answered in a sad tone, just 1 dose a day. I've tried everything to quit this crap, but despite my best efforts, I've only managed to limit myself to this extent. Alexander retorted with a cheerful voice, that's better than I feared. Don't worry, I was at 3 doses a day before, and still managed to work. You'll be fine. Diana was almost as shocked by this answer as she'd been at Alexander's accusation. After all, everyone knew it was impossible to quit crack. She sensed Alexander wasn't lying. So what was his secret? Alexander continued, one last question. Are you familiar with the world of MMORPGs? Diana was more and more confused by this string of questions. Like many, I partake in Horus in my free time. Work comes first, of course. Perfect, said Alexander. Listen, this is all great. I want to hire you to handle all the domestic chores in my apartment. After that, I also need an assistant in Horus. You'll get paid to play the game as well as to work as a regular butler. But once we sign our contract, you'll need to be 100% discreet about all the work you do for me. Do you accept? Chapter 90 Martial Situation. You are listening at novelfull.audio. On a hot and desert planet, 2 children were playing balloons under a blazing sun. The temperature was about 35 degrees Celsius, a particularly cold day for the planet Kronos I, but for the Geoils, humanoids like kangaroos, it was a suitable climate. The 2 children had been playing balloons almost all afternoon, but as they were getting ready to go back to their hut, one of the 2 children let go of the balloon. Thousands of black traces hid the burning sun of Kronos I, but the 2 children after a few seconds, saw that in fact this shadow was spaceships. Kronos has always been a very sparsely populated system and very poor in resources, and its membership in the Federation goes back only 10 years. The Geoil people had joined the Federation following the aggressive expansion of the Orc Empire. But while the 2 children were stupefied by what they saw in the distance, they heard a terrifying sound that was the alarm of the nearest big city. It was a sign that something bad was about to happen. They rushed home crying. At home their 2 parents were around a strange device called Supra Inverter, a device able to pick up any space radio wave provided it had the right frequency. It was an extremely common device in isolated colonies like the planet Kronos I. The Super Inverter announced a terrible news. The Orc fleet led by Warlord Renier had just violated the Federation border. This led to Grand Chancellor Soli declaring martial law throughout the Federation and appointing Grand Admiral Azeroth as special military governor of the Kronos, Diolas and Chios systems and their inhabited planets, including the one where the Geoil people live. This was an extremely serious measure for them. It probably meant that they would suffer the direct consequences of the war. On the planetary capital of Kronos I. Cruisers arrive over the metropolis. Thousands of Federation fighters fly over the planet, in a show of force to deter possible civil unrest following the federal government's announcement. Several shuttles land in the garden of the planet's governor's palace. A man in a colonel's uniform came out of the ship with several hundred Federal Special Forces soldiers. He rushed inside the palace, and evacuated the building's personnel except for the governor. This surreal scene took place almost everywhere on the planet, the special forces occupying the strategic points of the planet. The colonel turned on his hologram and said, "It is done, Admiral Azeroth. Kronos I is under quarantine, we are ready to defend the planet. And as you ordered, we have placed nuclear charges in the main cities of the planet. If the Orc land here, we will make them a maximum of loss." It was a desperate measure, but Azeroth had no choice. After 3 months of latent crisis, the Orc fleet had finally taken action and penetrated the borders of the Federation. Even if war had not yet been declared, the situation could at any moment degenerate into an open conflict between two space powers. Chancellor Soli had even been forced, despite suspicions of treason, to appoint Azeroth as military governor of 3 solar systems on the frontier, giving him more power than any other military officer in the Federation. In the upper atomosphere in a capital ship, a special meeting was held with Grand Admiral Azeroth, Grand Admiral Wesley, and a number of people who were conferring remotely in hologram forms such as Supreme Chancellor Soli, General Ralphit, and several political and military members. Many people hated each other at the meeting, but the situation of the Federation was so critical that they put their differences second. The country hadn't been at war with a galactic nation in more than 30 years, so this was a major event in the Federation's history. War and anti-martial law riots had even broken out throughout the Federation. And neither diplomatic discussions nor attempted mediation by the galactic community had been able to stop the escalation between the nations. The order of the meeting was simple. Was it necessary to declare war on the Orc Empire now that it had violated the sovereignty of the Federation? Obviously, supremacists like Azeroth wanted to, but the Chancellor and General Ralphit were against it. So the debate was deadlocked, nevertheless, until the fleet of the great warlord Renier was finally detected in the Kronos system, which put an end to the meeting. On his side, the Supreme Chancellor Soli prepared to announce to his people and to the rest of the galaxy the declaration of war.